Today we're going to be talking about wiring parameters inside of 3ds Max and how we can use those parameters to link two objects together and have them control pretty much anything that can be manipulated about those objects. So what I mean by that is, let's say for example I want the Z rotation of this object, my box, to control the X position of my teapot. Well, I can do that with a wiring parameter. And what's really neat about wiring parameters is even though we have things linked, it doesn't change our hierarchy. So if we had a child-parent relationship, our wiring parameter doesn't interfere with that. So let's talk about how we can get our wiring parameters. There's a couple of different ways. One in particular is if we have an object that we want to wire to something else, I can right-click and I have wiring parameters here. I can click on that. And then it's going to ask me, what is it specifically that you want to wire? So I have transform, which is my position, rotation, and scale. I have the object itself, so we can see here already that a wiring parameter can control the length, width, height, and segments. Then we have, this is the material, which I didn't name it, but it does have a material on there. I can change all of these different things on there, and I can have them either control or be controlled by another object. So what I'm going to say is we talked about the Z rotation. So here we see I have a dotted line. So 3ds Max is saying, all right, we know you want to either control the Z rotation or have the Z rotation control something, but what do you want it to do? On what other object? So I'm going to click my teapot and I'm going to say, I believe that we said the Z position, no, not Z position, X position. So transform position, X position, and then I get the parameter wiring dialog. And the reason why I did it that way is because we already have the objects that we had selected. They're already, the ones that we selected, they're already selected in here. What I mean by that is my teapot, I was talking about the X position, and my box, we already have the Z rotation. Now with this dialog, what we want to do is tell 3ds Max what we want to control. Okay, so if I wanted the box, the Z rotation, to control the teapot's X position, then I have three arrows here. Since I'm wanting the left object to control the right object, I'm going to choose the arrow that's pointing to the right. I basically want it to point towards what I want to be controlled, not what I'm wanting to do to control it, but what I want to be controlled. Okay, so I'm going to click the left arrow, or I'm sorry, yes, the left arrow that's going to the teapot, and then I'm going to connect them. Okay, and we already saw that it moved, our teapot moved, because our rotation of the box, it already has a value there of 0. So we can see here my rotation is 0, so my position of my teapot is 0. So if I were to come here and rotate my box on the Z-axis, we can see that it's controlling the position. And it's really slow. I have to move this quite a bit. So 360 degrees doesn't really move our teapot too much. Okay, if I wanted to change that, I can. In my wiring parameters here, I see that what's being controlled, or what's doing the controlling, is the Z rotation. If I wanted to make that even greater, then I can just multiply that. So let's say maybe the Z rotation times 10. Let's just say that. Now what I have to do now is, since I've changed my expression, I have to update it. So I'm going to update. And my teapot didn't move because 10 times 0 is still 0. But if I rotate, now we can see that I'm moving a lot more. Okay? Or maybe my rotation was too much. Like I barely wanted it to move at all. So instead of multiplying by 10, I'm going to divide by 10. And again, I'm going to update. And let's see what happens. So we can see that it's barely moving at all. Okay. Now I can change any of these things that I want. Maybe I want now the Z position of my box to control, let's say, maybe the Z position of my teapot. And again, I want my box to control my teapot, so I'm going to choose the arrow facing towards what I want to be controlled, and then let's connect it. Okay. Now, if I move my box on the Z-axis, we see that my teapot rotates on its Z-axis. If maybe I wanted it to spin the other way while I am moving my box upwards, then I'm just going to take the Z position and I'm going to add a negative sign in front of it. So that's basically going to invert the number. Update. And now what we'll see is when I move my box upwards, my teapot is going to spin the opposite way. Okay. Now we can, like I said, we can control a lot of things with these wiring parameters. And I'm just using these two as an example. So let's see what else we can do. Let's say maybe the X position of our box, and let's do something a little bit different. Let's say the X position of our box is going to change something in our object. Let's say it's going to change the radius of our object. So the more I move my object on the X axis, the bigger my teapot is going to be. So again, my box is going to control my teapot. So I'm going to point my controller towards the teapot and connect it. Now what we see is when I connected it, my teapot grew, and that's because the X value of my box is already 42.607. If I take this back to 0, we'll see that my teapot pretty much disappears. Okay, so one thing that I can do is change. Let's say that I wanted to have a condition where if I moved my box along the x-axis but I got to 0, I didn't actually want my teapot to be 0. Then I can do some very simplistic programming, or what's called an if-then statement. It's actually going to be called an if-then-else. So I can use that to control my box here, or rather the size of my teapot when my box goes to either 0 or the negative axis on X. So what I'm going to say is, first I'm going to start off with if, because I'm saying if something happens. If the X position of my box is less than or equal to 0, so I'm saying if it goes on the X-axis 0 or negative, so if it's less than or equal to 0, then I want something to happen. And what I want to happen is I'm going to say the X position equals 10. Okay, so I'm going to say that when it goes to 0 or negative, then the diameter of my teapot is just going to be 10. Else, if that doesn't happen, if it's not 0 or less, then I'm going to say else X position, and make sure that you spell everything correctly, because if you don't, it won't work. Else X position. So I'm just going to say if the position is less than or equal to 0, then we're going to say the position is 10. Otherwise, else, it's just the X position. So I'm going to update this, and let's see if it works. So I have my size of my teapot being controlled by the X-axis of the box, and let's go down to 0, and we see that pop. So just before I get to 0, you can see that my X-axis is 0.478, and that's the same size as my teapot. But when I go to 0, then my teapot pops to 10. Now, one way we could do this, if we had a character that had a jaw and we were rotating the jaw, and we never wanted the jaw to look like it's clipping into the face, then we could say if the rotation of that jaw is a certain degrees or more, then we want it to just stay still, so that we could close our mouth and never have to worry about that mouth clipping through. Okay, now so we've talked about how we can control different things with wiring parameters. Now let's see how we could use that to help us with animation. So I'm going to get rid of this, close this, and I've got a hand here that I have in the scene. What I want to do is I want to use wiring parameters to control these fingers. And I'm going to show probably one because we don't want to have a super long video, how we can control different aspects of this finger. So let's say maybe we're going to curl that finger and maybe spread that finger if we were going to have our fingers together or our fingers apart. And I'm going to do this with another object called a manipulator. So first let's create our manipulator. So I'm going to go to the Create tab because I want to create something. Then I'm going to go to Helpers because manipulators are helpers. From Standard, I'm going to go to Manipulator, and I'm going to choose a slider. Now here, the first thing I want to do is label it so that I know what it is, and I'm going to say finger control. Okay, my value, this is the value that I'm going to start off at. I'm going to start off at 0. My minimum, I can change that. I can change my maximum. I'm going to leave those alone. Our X position and Y position and width, these won't really do anything until we place our slider. So I have a slider in my scene. It's named what I told it to be named, finger control. Now I can adjust the X position if I want. I can adjust the Y position. I can adjust the length to whatever I want to do. I can still adjust the minimum, maximum, and the value and whatnot. But for what we're going to do, I'm going to go ahead and leave it alone. So I'm going to select my manipulator, and although my finger is called finger control, in the scene it's still called slide manipulator. So I'm going to name that also and just say finger control slider. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say this finger slider is going to control some of the bones. So maybe I'll hide this for right now so I don't have to worry about clicking it. So I'm going to hide selection. That's not what I wanted to do. Just wanted just this one, hide selection. Now I have my bones. So I'm going to select my bone, and I can do the right click wiring parameters that I did before, or I can just come up to my animation tab, click on it, click on wiring parameters, and I'm just going to open that wiring dialog. So there's that dialog that we had before. And then now, since I have something selected already, I can come to my wiring dialog and just say refresh it. And basically this is going to say whatever I have selected, put it here. And that's what we have, finger index 01. And I'm going to want the rotation on the Y rotation, I believe. Okay, so I have that. And then I'm going to come over and select my manipulator and say refresh it, and I want the value. So when we move this slider, we're going to be changing the value. So that's what I want to control my bone. So I'm going to say the value. And I want my slider to control the bone. So I'm going to choose the arrow pointing towards what I want to control, and I'm going to connect it. Okay, now what we'll see is when I try to move my slider, and right now I can't move my slider, and the reason, if we take a look at this color, it's yellow, it's because my slider isn't active. In order to make it so that I can adjust and manipulate the slider, I actually have to come up to this button here called Select and Manipulate. I'm going to turn it on, and I know it's on because it's blue, and now we see my slider has turned green. And now I can take that and rotate it, and we see that I've rotated it on the wrong axis. So I'm going to disconnect this, and let's try the X rotation and connect. Okay, now we can see it's moving, but it's moving a lot. So what I'm going to do is come in and say the value may be divided by 50. Let's see if 50 is good. And I'm going to update it. Move my slider again. That looks pretty good. Maybe I'll even change that to 60, just a little bit more. And update it. There we go. Now I'm going to do the same thing for all of the fingers, all the finger bones here. So I'm going to select, let's see, that one's good. Let's do here. Finger bone index, or finger index 02. Rotation, I believe it was on the X-axis. Connect, and I already know that I want to divide this by 60. Let's connect it and see if I've got it right. Okay, now I've got that finger, more of it rotating. I'm going to open up my my Scene Explorer so I can get the right bone here. Let's see, palm 01, is that what I want? Let's see. No, that's not what I want. Okay, so I've got those two selected. So if I unhide my hand, let's see what happens. Okay, so I need one more here, I believe. That's the one I want. Okay, so I'm going to again adjust that one. I believe on the X rotation, I already know I want to multiply it by 60. Connect. Now I'm controlling that entire finger with just one slider. And I can do that for each finger. I can have a slider that controls each finger. Now what I want to do is maybe do one so that my finger can rotate either towards or away from my other finger. So I'm going to create another slider and maybe name it finger swing. Now you can name it whatever you want. That's perfectly fine. And again, I'm going to go to my manipulator and name it. All right. And then again, I want to select, is it this bone? No, I don't think so. Here. This is the action I want to do. Okay. So I've got my finger index 0, 1, and then I want to select my other manipulator. Here, again, I want the value. And I want my manipulator to control my finger. As soon as I choose, so which one do I want this on? I want this on the Z rotation. And I'm going to maybe go ahead and do this by 100. Connect. So it's not the Z rotation, or did I choose Y? Disconnect. Connect. All right, here we go. But instead, I want my hand to move outwards. So here, it's moving the wrong direction. So all I'm going to do is come in and turn that into the negative value, update it, and now I'll swing outwards, and that's too much. So maybe we'll do 150, update. Okay. And then if I wanted to go the other way a little bit, then maybe I can even come into the properties of this and change my minimum from 0 to maybe -20. And then I'll be able to move the other way as well. So what we looked at today was wiring parameters and how we can use those wiring parameters to control pretty much anything on an object. So what I would invite you to do is to play around with that and have a lot of fun and see what you can create with that.